All right. Well, thank you for being here. My name is Sadie Hundemer. Please just call me Sadie. And I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing regarding specifically the Floridan Aquifer as a whole, and how we communicate about water within these stakeholder groups. Now, I'm with the Department of Agricultural Education and Communication. I am primarily a natural resources communicator. I got my PhD here in the forestry department, so the same department as Matt Cohen. And for the past, I guess, almost 6 years now, I've been working on this project. And this is a big project with a lot of people on it. This is called FACETS. It's the Floridan Aquifer Collaborative Engagement for Sustainability Project. And who you see here in this picture is researchers from University of Florida, researchers from Georgia and Alabama, but also a lot of stakeholders. So stakeholders from agriculture, forestry, environmental interests, community leaders. And we are all working together on this project to understand how different land management practices, mostly in agriculture, but we also look at forestry, what is the impact of those decisions for the future of water and for the future of the economy in Florida going forward in the future. And all of these people are involved in this because they all have a stake. And if they all are invested in the outcomes of this research, then we're more likely to have trust in it going forward. And what I've seen over the course of this project is stakeholders that were maybe not as trusting of each other at the beginning become very trusting and very much want to work together because they see that, hey, if we join forces on these things, that's where we have the most impact and most potential to get what we want. And so I'm on this project as part of the communication team. So I do communication research. And so what I'm wondering is, like, how do we get the stakeholders of the Floridan Aquifer to that place where we can work together effectively, but not everybody has 6 years to invest in it. So can we talk about water in a way that helps get us there across stakeholder groups more quickly? Now, I don't think I probably need to explain too much about the Floridan Aquifer to you, but just in case. So here we have the Floridan Aquifer in the brown and the blue. And what's really special about the blue parts of this map is that these are the unconfined areas, meaning that there's not a protective clay layer that prevents water from moving down from the surface down into the groundwater. And so those areas are great because they allow our aquifer to refill and maintain our water availability from groundwater, but they're also dangerous.
Does that mean that rivers that go over those blue areas put more water down into the aquifer than the brown, than the rivers that go over the brown areas?
Yeah.
There's people who can answer those questions better than me, but yeah, there's definitely a connection between a lot of the rivers and certainly, obviously, springs, but lakes of Florida and those underground systems. And so in those areas, we may see more of that. I'm just not so familiar with that.
Recharge the soil, and you could probably talk more about this, but the soil would allow for more recharge versus the other ones that are literally running off into some sort of collective basin where it might infiltrate into the aquifer. Yeah. But in those unconfined, it just automatically,
yeah, it's just that it can seep down through the soil down into the groundwater. And then that groundwater can feed surface systems elsewhere. But while that's a real benefit of those areas to our aquifer system, the danger is that these are areas where that water is seeping down and whatever it carries with it goes down into the aquifer. So what we have in those areas is a lot of ag, and that's why part of the reason that we focus so much on ag, particularly in this project. But the contributors to these challenges are obviously not ag, but I focus on it here because that's the scope of our project. And we can think about what are the better and worse scenarios for these areas. Well, ag certainly has problems, but if we don't have ag, what do we have there instead? It's probably residential development that brings in its own issues. And so it's in ag's interest and environmental interest to protect these areas for ag and for all of the benefits that these areas provide. So this project that I work on has representatives from all of these groups, and these are stakeholders that exist beyond this project. And what we did is we asked people in all of these groups, first of all, who do you identify as? We asked them as individuals, where do you identify? Who are you? And people aren't just one thing, right? So somebody can be all of these things. You can be a producer and consider yourself an environmentalist. You can be a community leader and a forest landowner. But we were trying to figure out is generally what group somebody falls in. And then we asked them, how similar are your views with those other groups? Do you think you see water the same way? These are the two that feel like their ideas are the most different, producers and environmentalists. And so I wanted to know, well, what is it that they're so different on? What do they think they're different on? And what are they actually different on? And when we start doing research on this to understand what are they similar and different on, it's actually pretty hard to figure out what they're different on because they were so similar on so many things. And I'm not going to go through all of that data, but here's the big kind of takeaways. First of all, both of them see big risk to surface and groundwater, and both think that if we have to prioritize a limited water supply, that water should go to crops and it should go to ecosystems, and both groups said that. But there's one big area of difference that was really the only main area of difference that we saw coming through in the questions that we were asking, and that's this one. The perceptions of producers, or agricultural people, their contribution to water issues. That was the big thing that they felt was different. And on the environmentalist side, and again, people can be both, but we're looking at who is primarily categorizing themselves as one or the other. Environmentalists say, well, the ag groups, they don't have our land ethic, and they're not treating water with the respect that they should. On the ag side, they're saying, wait a minute, we're getting blamed for everything here. This is a communal problem. Also, that environmentalists aren't seeing that there are economic trade-offs that we have to consider in how we make decisions. So I now want to go a little deeper here and know, why do they see this differently? And then what can we do about it? Because maybe we can get them to a place where they don't see themselves as in conflict and in this blame situation that isn't helping them communicate. So I use this process that's called mental modeling. And all of this is a setup so I can show you what they're actually thinking about. But I want to talk you through the steps that I take because it helps you understand where this is coming from and why we should trust it. So mental modeling is, we kind of have mental models of anything in our world. We have our perceptions of how the world works, and we have perceptions about how people think. You can have a mental model of the map of campus, and then you realize that when you actually get on campus, and you see an overview of campus that, oh, that's not what I thought it was at all, but it was an operational model. So this isn't somebody's mental model of something isn't necessarily right or complete, but if we can understand how somebody thinks about something, now we know how to talk to them in a more effective way. So before I go there, what we did is I sat down with a bunch of producers and a bunch of environmentalists, and one-on-one they did this activity. And so we asked them, first of all, think about this prompt, and just sit and think on it for a minute. And you can do the same. Imagine someone you know recognizes your knowledge of local water issues, water quality and quantity, and asks for your honest perspective on the relationships between water and the regional economy. So I just have them sit and think about that for a while. Imagine someone you know recognizes your knowledge of local water issues and asks for your honest perspective on the relationships between water and the regional economy. And then I give them a stack of cards. And it's about 60 cards. This is a sample of them. But it's got things related to ag, environment, the economy, anything that could be part of that system. And then we have them do some things with these cards. Before I go there. OK, so we have to do some things with these cards. First of all, say I have them take these. They've got these 60 cards, and I'm saying, OK, put them into 2 piles. I want a pile of things that you would include in that conversation and a pile that you wouldn't. Now, those cards that you wouldn't include, let's just get rid of those. We're not going to use them anymore. Now, here's some blank cards. There's probably words that you'd use in that conversation. I didn't give you a card for them. Write down what terms you would also include that I didn't give you a card for. Now they've got a bigger stack of cards. Now, take those, sort them into logical groupings, things that go together in your mind. And now finally, take a colored card and give each of those groups a name. Give it a category name. So at the end of this, what we have, now this is for one person, but we have many people doing this, but for one person, I've kind of got a representation of their mental model of this relationship between water and the regional economy. So this one person has a group of things related to risks and environment and land use and agriculture and economy. And so you can kind of think about this like gears that turn separately but together. And so for this person, these big domains of thought are those gears. So if you have the risks kind of turns with, but it turns on its own, but it's a separate thing, but it also is influencing environment and agriculture and so on. But I am not interested in how one person thinks about it. I want to know how producers think about it. What is their mental model of the system? I want to know how environmentalists think about it. And maybe they're different. And maybe if they're different, then there's something that's getting in the way of effective communication that I can help fix or resolve so that they can communicate more effectively, or I can communicate with them more effectively. So we use a software that takes this and creates a map that looks like this. So for producers, we're looking at just producers here. Each of these points is one of the terms that was on one of those cards. And roughly speaking, the distance between any points is how often they were grouped together by producers. So producers very often would put agricultural water use permits and crop yield in the same cluster and would very infrequently group risk management with lawn fertilizer. Okay? Also what is happening here is the software is saying, if we were going to imagine this as card setup for producers as a whole, well, what would be those stacks? So one stack would be agriculture. One would be environment, municipal, socioeconomic. And now we're seeing as a whole kind of how this group is thinking. And we should expect these are producers that they're going to think about a lot of things in terms of agriculture. And that's what we see reflected here. Now, they also have a group of things that's related to municipal, kind of seeing that as separate from ag, as environment is also separate from ag, but connected to it. Socioeconomic is kind of in the middle, connecting all of these things. And I kind of look at this as an operational view of the system. There's these different components that are all part of this topic of water in the regional economy. But they all kind of have their separate space. Now, that's not immediately clear that this is different than anything else until you look at environmentalists' mental model. And they look at it very differently. So instead of those kind of isolated spots, now we see water impacts, the big thing that overarches everything. Water management is this big sector. Decision making. We didn't see those in agriculture. In agriculture, we had that kind of farm level view where like, okay, what's impacting water and the economy at a farm scale? Environmentalists don't look at it that way. They're looking at like a watershed scale view. What are the big things that are having negative impacts and what can we do about them? And so these, we can spend hours just investigating all of the little components of the different ways they look at it. But overall, we see that they're set up to have a different view of agriculture, right? That was our big point of difference between these two groups, is how they perceived the impact of ag. And producers are seeing that farm scale perspective. They know what they are doing on their land to protect water, and what that means for what they're applying to the land and how much water they're using. Environmentalists, they don't have that view. They have a view of the impacts on a big scale. And producers don't necessarily see those big scale impacts, and environmentalists don't necessarily see what the producers are doing on the land. And so we can then get in a place where when we talk about the impacts of ag, it can seem unfair on one side and insufficient on the other. What we can also do with this is now not just understand kind of the issue more, but get some strategies for how to deal with it. So each of these terms, here's your terms here. We can think about where are they falling on that map? Where they come up in somebody's mental model. So if I start talking about a term like agricultural fertilizer, what things is it associated with in the minds of a producer? What things is it associated with in the minds of an environmentalist? Now, specifically, let's look at this one, nutrients. And I could do this with any of them, but let's play with nutrients. So I'm somebody who talks about water a lot. And when I talk about nutrients, and I use that term nutrients, producers are thinking about agriculture. And they're thinking about, if we go back and look at what it's associated with things like their crop yield and how successful they're going to be on their farms. At the same time that environmentalists are thinking about water impacts and the negative implications for our water and our ecosystems. And so, wow, if I'm just saying the word nutrients and I'm taking these people to two different places that have very positive implications on one side and very negative implications on the other, well, I'm just setting them up, right, for being in conflict. It doesn't mean that I don't use the word nutrients, because we have to use the word nutrients. But I have to know that they're both going to these places and consider that in how I talk about it, so that I'm not setting us up for a debate that shouldn't happen. If I know what I'm doing as a communicator, I shouldn't let that happen. Here's another one. Where, if I'm talking about uncertainty, where are these groups going? Producers are thinking about their socioeconomic security as environmentalists are thinking about environmental uncertainty. So any word that we use, any topic that we bring up, we're kind of taking them potentially to different places. And again, I just need to be aware of that so that I can hedge against it. Here's another thing we can think about. Remember I had them go through these cards and put them in the stack of things that you would include in the conversation, meaning those are part of your mental model. And we had the cards we're going to get rid of. It's not part of that conversation. Well, these are the terms that producers included more frequently than environmentalists. First one, risk management. Top on the list here, in terms of difference between the two, 71% of producers include that term. They think this is something, risk management is something very important to have as part of that conversation of the relationship between water and the regional economy. Only 38% of environmentalists did the same. And so maybe if we want to get these two groups to a state where they can understand each other's perspectives and concerns, I need to talk to environmentalists more about risk management and why maybe a producer feels the need to apply extra in order to make sure they make their yield and have profit. That's not necessarily something that is in this mental model. You could also see precision agriculture is part of the mental model of 93% of producers, 67% of environmentalists. So that's another opportunity. Let's talk more about precision agriculture and the technologies that can be used to help offset these problems. We can do the same thing from the other side, though. These are terms that were selected more frequently by environmentalists and less frequently by producers. So first on the list there, 63% of environmentalists said climate change should be part of that conversation, and 36% of producers did. Now, before you jump to a conclusion that it's easy to jump to, because I would have done the same, it's not that producers are saying climate change isn't real, because one specifically told me, does not mean I don't think it's real. It's because they're saying that's not one of the things I would talk about, because I don't think it's central to this conversation about water in the regional economy. But environmentalists are saying, yes, it is. So maybe that's where we need to talk to producers more about the implications of climate change for that relationship. And again, we could do this with any of these items. How can we get them to a more common mental model that is going to facilitate communication instead of breaking it down? So kind of the big takeaways here, for me anyways, I'll let you say what yours are, is that first of all, when we talked about what is similar and what's different, I'm focusing on differences here because that's the interesting thing to talk about, right? But the vast majority was similarities. And they have they want the same things, and ultimately they want the same outcomes because we all want to protect water and ag from this becoming residential or something else. They both see risk, and they both see this, or they both have the same goals in terms of they want to make sure ag retains water and ecosystems retain water. And when we see differences between these groups, and particularly on their perception of how much ag is to blame, it makes sense based on what we see. It's their mental models are based on their experience, and that's what we should expect. But now that we know this, we can work with this information to improve stakeholder collaboration and create those opportunities for them to cross over and see the issue from the other's perspective, and hopefully break down some of those conversations and feelings of blame that tend to break down their willingness to work together and ability to work together. So that's kind of a walk through my work on this topic, and I'm curious to understand your takeaways and how you see the issue in this data. Yes?
Question. So you were saying that there's this disagreement in terms of the ways in which certain things get prioritized by the different groups, and that what we need to do is educate the people who prioritize that number less to make it a higher priority. And I guess in my mind, I started spinning my wheels on that. I was like, well, if everything's a high priority, then nothing's a high priority. And so how exactly do you negotiate the...
So it's not priority. I think you didn't see the first part of how this is. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So what this is, it's what is in the mental model of a producer versus an environmentalist when they're thinking about the relationship between water and the regional economy. And so we have one group that has a high percentage of their thinking about, for producers, risk management is part of their conception of that issue, and it's not a big part of that conception for environmentalists.
And
So it's more, if it was the case that, which I'm not saying this is, but if we're saying, if we think from a scientific point of view that risk management shouldn't be part of that conversation, then we could deal about that in a different way, rather than trying to add it to environmentalists. So it's not necessarily that I'm trying to increase things in someone's mental model that don't deserve to be there. It's just we want them to see things that are important to each other. Yeah.
I was just thinking, because of course the farmers, everyone involved in agriculture, it's in their best interest. They're following the law. They're pumping and polluting as much as they feel the need to, and they're following the best management practices. But I think it'd be more realistic if you also involve the water district officials that believe we can pump out as much as we're pumping out, even during drought years, and really see where they differ on the issue as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And so I'm showing you environmentalist and ag because that's where they saw the most difference between themselves in water views, but we did do the same thing for all of those other stakeholder groups that you saw at the beginning. When we were seeing where are the differences there, and we could do the same thing with them. In fact, that's something that we can do very easily if someone wanted to make those comparisons and see, okay, how do different groups see it relative to the people who are regulating.
Have you come across very many examples of someone who thinks in both boxes, as it were? I'm thinking of a friend of mine who has a cattle ranch, and he's on the water board locally, and he's very, very passionate environmentalist, and so you put those things together. He can, go through the checklist, and he's thought them all through in terms of how what the ramifications are, and then conducts his business in a way that is reflective of his environmental concerns. So, I think he's kind of special, because I think a lot of people get locked into their own kind of box, and what you're talking about is how can we bring that together.
Yeah.
And he's an example of someone who has managed to bridge that territory.
Yes, and so like I said about this is a group that's been going on for 6 years, and we've gotten everyone pretty much, well, I would say everyone, but most people to that state where we can see from different perspectives, but it is a difficult thing to get to that state. And so all of these people who are part of this project now who have that ability are now kind of the advocates for going back to their organizations and saying, let's give the other side a break. Like, how can we find, actually we have a lot in common. Let's find ways to work with the other group, because maybe we have differences of opinion on smaller things, but if you look at the broader issue where relative to other ways that land could be used and the areas that we're moving toward more development, well, these are actually groups that have a lot in common and a lot of shared interest, and how can we capitalize on that? Yeah.
Forgive me for having missed some of your earlier presentation, but do you think, just based on the questions, that Florida might ultimately have to adapt some of the models that California, Nevada, and the Southwest have had when it comes to water usage and who gets what water, because the pumping in one metropolis affects the overall levels all across a wide and vast area. And I mean, from just my own personal experience and like dating back the last few decades, looking at the levels, if you go out to some of these lakes out in Clay County here, and the area around Georgia P, and the other spots, where nice recreational, and you can just see it from the size of where the docks were. A dock that's 30 years old is way up here, and where did all the water go?
Yeah, as far as where we might be moving policy-wise, I really am not the person to speak to that. And we have lots of water scientists and policy scientists that work on that part. But I'm focused on, no matter what solution we have or lack of solutions, how can we all work together toward the best water security we can have under whatever that situation is.
Well, maybe we should potentially look west and see what they've done, or at least how they've had to deal with all parties concerned. I mean, pity the poor guy who wants a green lawn in Los Angeles. It ain't going to happen. This is at certain times, because they do have the water police out there.
Yeah, great points.
Do laws are different out west?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
The laws here are riparian laws, where we consider water to be a common good. Out west, it's whoever gets to it first, prior appropriation, it's theirs.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hard to compare the two.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm wondering what we do with this knowledge, and maybe you answered it earlier, but is it, I feel like what I'm hearing is that the words we use really matter, so is it being more specific, or is it, as you're saying, we try to use those common values and common goals to...
Yes, I think, and I really do think that's the takeaway, is to recognize that we have common values, and that there are little insidious ways that we talk that counter the good of those values. And so one of the things that you can do and that we've done is put these models in front of these groups and say, look, we both see it different ways, but they're both right. And now, oh, I understand why you think that, or why you talk about it that way. It's not that it's about me. Like, you're not degrading me as an individual. We're just seeing it from different perspectives. So back at the beginning here, and I said, okay, there's these different stakeholder groups, and everybody identifies to a different degree with different ones, or not just one stakeholder group or the other. One that I didn't have on that list was conservationist. And almost all, the reason I didn't do the comparison between producers and conservationists is because almost all of them say they are conservationists. Okay, so there's no point for comparison there. But the reason that I have the two on there to ask how much you identify with is because I feel like there was going to be a difference in how people responded. When we were talking about it after the fact in this project meeting, where it is represented with all these stakeholders, and it's come up, why don't you identify as an environmentalist? It's like, the answers were things like, well, that's the group that's blaming me. And so if that's the sentiment, then no, I'm not an environmentalist, but I am a conservationist. And so if we're talking in a way that like creates a feeling of blame, and even we're doing it in ways we don't realize we're doing it, that's the trick. And so, and it goes the other way too. Like, they can see producers can see environmentalists in ways that aren't fair also. And we're making that happen in little ways that we don't realize we're doing, and breaking down the conversation as a result. And we should be able to get to a place where everybody can identify as an environmentalist. Yeah.
I've been following Greg's thing, like just choosing words. I get involved with a lot of forested landowners who tend to probably come from the ag conservationist realm. And so if you say things like, springs regulations or minimum flow, like just the sort of regulatory language that's used, they're allergic to that. It's very clear. But if you say stewardship, and they perk up, like they view themselves as clearly as stewards, and I want to sort of be engaged in stewardship in a proactive way. And I wonder if you've encountered other words that kind of harmonize these groups in ways that, like, don't alienate them. That it isn't language that sort of creates good guys and bad guys. I'd love to hear those words.
Yeah. Well, let's go back. Because certainly I'm not going.
Nutrients is a bad word. That's really tricky.
Well, I wouldn't say that nutrients is a bad word. It's a word that when you're using it, you need to make sure you're accounting for, these are the implications for one group, this is the benefits for the other. We can have a nuanced view of nutrients. And I think that's the key, is that often we don't have a nuanced view. So I think if you want a point of agreement, everybody agrees that these are problems. I think that...
That's just like a shared bad guy.
Yeah, that's just a shared bad guy. Yes. I think that, it's all in context, right? But I think there is agreement in general that conservation is a positive across the board. And I don't know that I could say, like, this is the specific word, but...
Well, maybe conservation isn't. I mean, conservation is a word that doesn't maybe have the alarm.
Yeah. True.
Have you seen the latest podcast that the Florida Farm Bureau has put out about security?
No.
It's a new one, and I don't see that on there anywhere. Or maybe water scarcity maybe implies that, but
Yeah.
the latest language that they are using to do what they do when they want to do what they do without any regulatory or overreach is security, which I was really fascinating podcast that was about an hour long on how they were trying to brand their industry, which is agriculture, to national security. Yeah, it was very interesting because once they do that, none of this is going to matter. Like, they're just going to say, oh, you know, we get to do what we want because, you know, because the world's going to, you know, blow up or whatever.
Was that Florida or national?
Florida Farm Bureau. Florida Farm Bureau podcast. You can Google it,
Okay.
and listen to it, and it was on national security and agriculture. Because that's going to change, once they really brand that, that is going to change so much of how we talk about things. Again, with your communication.
Well, and security is, we're in this world where someone grabs a word and now it means something that it didn't mean, right? But we can have security regarding our economy, we can have security regarding our environment, and it's all, dependent on ultimately how the values that ultimately get attached to any word.
Yeah, it came after COVID. They talked about it. They said once COVID became real to them, it was then a matter of national security because they recognized that they couldn't get the food out.
Yes.
They couldn't do certain things to get the food out, you know, because of COVID.
But you're saying that's like a Trojan horse to navigate through, like, because we're integral to national security, therefore your effort to regulate water supply is misplaced.
That's how it's sounded to me.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work in the realm of, like, especially small geographically isolated wetlands and sort of the clean water rule, and a lot of the same language about, you know, food sovereignty and sort of the national security interests of, it's very interesting.
Food sovereignty is another one.
Yeah.
I don't see that exactly up there, but yeah,
Right.
that's another one. These are the newer
Yeah.
nuances that they're because we've probably all talked about this till we're blue in the face on both sides. I know I've met with lots of ag producers, and these are new ones.
And it should be something that both groups should be conscious of. That are we, creating more words that are divisive, and like, let's step back. And if we are in a place where we can have those conversations, now we can prevent things like that from escalating and being divisive. But we just have to form those spaces so that when the new thing arises, it's not just, okay, how are we going to fight about it?
Yeah, because the security also had to do with, us pushing to end phosphate mining. Well, you can't end phosphate. It's going to hurt our, whatever, security. Like, well, so I can just see that as their Trojan horse, as you said. That's a good way to put that.
Any final questions or comments? All right, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you coming.